Hello, welcome back. Hopefully you just watched the previous video about consequentialism and the principle of utility, in which I gave you a definition and description of utilitarianism, a little bit of a history of utilitarian philosophy, and an argument in defense of it. This video is a criticism of utilitarianism. We're going to talk about problems for utilitarianism and the principle of utility. You'll remember that the principle of utility says that the right thing to do is the thing that results in the most happiness and least unhappiness for the greatest number of people. So it's a consequentialist moral principle because it says that the right thing to do is the thing that has the best results or consequences. It's a hedonistic moral principle because it says that happiness and pleasure are good, and unhappiness and pain and suffering are bad. And it's an impartial moral principle because it says each person's happiness gets equal consideration. Now, I'm going to try to call all three of these ideas into doubt, starting with consequentialism. So if consequentialism is correct, then the morality of our actions depends entirely on the future consequences of our actions. That is, the right thing to do is the thing that results in the best future. Which means that if consequentialism is correct, there really aren't any morally relevant facts in the past. The problem is there are morally relevant facts in the past. The consequences aren't the only thing that matter. So think about it this way. If you have a timeline, where time 1 is the past, and time 2 is the present, and time 3 is the future. What the consequentialist thinks is that the morality of our conduct at time 2 depends entirely on the consequences of that conduct at time 3. That anything that happened at time 1 is irrelevant to assessing the morality of our conduct. But if you think about it, there are going to be some problems for that view. One example I like to give my students is the example of adultery. Do you think that adultery is morally wrong? Probably many of you, if not most of you, will say so. It's like, okay, so it's wrong to marry somebody and then have an affair with somebody else. But now suppose I ask you, what's so bad about adultery? What's wrong with that? Now, one thing you might say is, well, Mr. G, adultery is wrong because it causes suffering. That is, if you cheat on your husband or you cheat on your wife, they find out, they get their hearts broken, they're going to be angry, they're going to be sad, they're going to feel betrayed, they're going to lose trust, they're going to be very unhappy. And then you have to get a divorce, and then you're going to have to go through the divorce courts, and you're going to have to pay alimony, and the suffering is going to be even worse if you have children, because then there's going to be a custody battle over the children, and the kids are going to blame themselves, and they're going to think, that daddy doesn't love them, and they're going to grow up with mental health problems, and they're going to be they're more likely to be drug addicts and criminals and have bad relationships of their own. And so adultery is bad because it causes divorce and broken homes and fatherlessness and all kinds of suffering. If you think that's what makes adultery bad, then you're thinking like a consequentialist. That is, you're saying the thing that makes adultery bad is it has these negative consequences in the future that happen as a result of it. But that's only if you get caught. I mean, look, suppose that you commit adultery and you don't get caught. Well, what your husband or wife doesn't know won't hurt her or him. Right? That is, if you don't get caught, they don't find out, they don't get their feelings hurt, you don't have to get a divorce, you don't have to pay the alimony, you don't have to break up your home, everything's fine. But now, hopefully, at least some of you are like, no, I don't care whether or not you get caught, Mr. D, it's still wrong. It's still wrong even if nobody suffers. And it's wrong because you made a vow. You stood on the altar in front of God and everybody and made a solemn vow that I swear to love you and only you forever and ever until death do us part. Right? And that when you commit adultery, it involves the breaking of that vow, that vow you took placed you under an obligation. Well, if that's what you think makes adultery wrong, that it involves the breaking of a vow, you're no longer thinking like a consequentialist. You're not saying it's the future harm that makes it wrong. You're saying it's the promise you made in the past placed you under an obligation. That is, you're saying there's a morally relevant fact in the past. That's one example. I'll give you one other. Think about criminal justice. What justifies punishing criminals? So this will be easiest if you think of cases where you think it is justified to punish criminals. So maybe the most kind of heinous, depraved, violent criminals, the murderers and the rapists. Most of us will agree that morally we are justified in putting them in prison. But what justifies that decision morally? Well, one thing you might say is, well, we punish criminals because it makes society safer. That is, when we put the criminal in jail, we take them off the streets and they can't hurt anybody else. And maybe the fact that we put criminals in jail deters other criminals from committing crimes, or other potential criminals from committing crimes. And maybe it also teaches the people who we do punish a lesson. So maybe criminal punishment is justified because it deters crimes, it makes society safer, and maybe rehabilitates criminals. If you think those kinds of things are the reasons that it's morally right to punish criminals, then you're thinking like a consequentialist. That is, we punish criminals in the present because it makes society safer in the future. It deters crime. But suppose I ask you this. Can we punish the innocent? I mean, you can imagine cases in which punishing the innocent would deter crime. It would make society safer. So the easiest example of this is something that's called vicarious punishment. So in addition to punishing the criminal, we can also punish the people he cares about. So, so if you have a murderer, you punish him, but you also punish his mom and his wife and his children. That would have a great deterrent effect. That is, the criminal might not even care if you lock him in a cage, but he might hesitate if he knows you're going to lock his mother in a cage. You see? And in fact, a lot of sort of authoritarian, totalitarian societies, they do practice vicarious punishment. So famously, in North Korea, one of the things that deters people from escaping into South Korea is that if they do, the loved ones they leave behind will be punished in their absence. And so punishing innocent people can have a profound deterrent effect on crime in the future. Now, hopefully you'll say, I don't care whether it would deter crime or not, it's categorically wrong to punish the innocent. Regardless of the consequences. That we don't punish people to deter crime, we punish people because they committed a crime. We punish people because they deserve it. If that's what you think, you're not a consequentialist, you see, because if you think that we punish people in the present because of a crime they committed in the past, because they deserve it because of a crime they committed in the past, because the punishment in the present should fit the crime they committed in the past, you're not thinking like a consequentialist anymore. If you think it's wrong to punish the innocent because they didn't commit a crime in the past, you're not thinking like a consequentialist anymore, because you're not looking forward into the future. You're looking backwards into the past. This point about not punishing the innocent is one of the biggest problems with consequentialism. The textbook author calls this the problem of injustice. We can imagine cases where committing an unjust act would have some future benefit. Okay, so consequentialism can't be true for that reason. So put it this way. Consequentialism cannot be true because there are morally relevant facts in the past. For example, making a promise places you under an obligation, and punishment should fit the crime. Well, what about hedonism? Hedonism is the idea that happiness is good and unhappiness is bad. I told you in the last video that I'm sympathetic to the hedonist position because I think that the idea that morality is about reducing suffering is about as good as you can do if you want to have a secular morality. But there's a real problem with hedonism, which is that sometimes happiness is bad. Sometimes unhappiness is good. There's all kinds of ways of talking about this. But I think the clearest example of this is to point out that sometimes people enjoy things that they should not enjoy. Sometimes people take pleasure in things that they should not take pleasure in. The philosopher James Rachels gives an example that I think is really good. Consider the peeping Tom, the voyeur. Well, what's going on with him? Well, he has this kind of, I don't know, perversion where he is, and I'm using the masculine pronoun deliberately. It's almost always men who are voyeurs. Maybe not always, but usually. Where he is what? Aroused by spying on other people and, their, usually, spying on naked women, say. So this is, it used to be the peeping Tom would, get a pair of binoculars and try to look through a young lady's bedroom window at night and catch her in her negligee, or nowadays I take it the voyeurs use hidden cameras. There's actually a very high-profile case of this, where some pervert at a hotel had put a hidden camera in, I think, Aaron Andrews' bathroom. You maybe remember this. Okay, so consider the voyeur, or the peeping Tom. Hopefully most of you understand that what he's doing is wrong. But, well, why is it wrong? And it's like, well, he's violating the privacy of the person he's spying on. And, if she finds out, she's going to be pretty unhappy. She's going to feel embarrassed, violated, ashamed, exposed, insecure, unsafe. But what if she doesn't find out? What she doesn't know won't hurt her. You see the trouble here? Think about it this way. The utilitarian says the right thing to do is the thing that results in the greatest overall happiness. So morality is about promoting happiness and preventing suffering. So consider the peeping Tom who does not get caught. In that case, is the total amount of happiness in the world increased or decreased? Well, it's increased, right? Because he's enjoying himself, and she doesn't know, what she doesn't know won't hurt her. But hopefully you say, I don't care whether or not the total amount of happiness in the world is increased or decreased. That's wrong. It's wrong because it's a violation of her rights. It's a violation of her rights whether she knows it's happening or not. But if you're talking in those terms, if you're talking in terms of what the rights are, you're not thinking like a consequentialist anymore. But simply put here, the voyeur might enjoy or get happiness out of spying on women, but he shouldn't. That is, his happiness is actually bad. Okay, so hedonism cannot be true because sometimes happiness is bad, sometimes unhappiness is good. Oh, unhappiness being good, I have to say something about this. Because how could unhappiness be good? Here's an easy, or not an easy, here's an example of unhappiness being good. Grief. Grief is, if you've never grieved, you will. And if you have grieved, you know, like, it's immense suffering, like, and sometimes debilitating. There's guilt, and there's blame, and there's bargaining, and it's well, grief is definitely unhappiness, but is grief a bad thing? It's like, oh, no, not exactly. I mean, it's easiest to see this if you think of what you would have to do to avoid grief. The only way you can avoid grief is by never loving anybody, by never caring about anybody. That is, when you grieve over a loss, it's because you've lost somebody you loved. And so, grief's actually an expression of love, and love's a good thing. And so, in a way, it's a good thing. I don't think if you lead your life in such a way as to avoid all suffering that you'll actually have a good life. Because the only way to avoid all suffering is to avoid loving anybody. It's a little less clear, but you get the point. So maybe grief is good. So sometimes unhappiness is good, and clearly, some people take pleasure in things that they shouldn't, and so sometimes happiness is bad. Okay, so hedonism cannot be true because sometimes happiness is bad and unhappiness is good. All right, well, so consequentialism's wrong and hedonism's wrong, but what about impartiality? This to me seems the strength of the utilitarian position, honestly. I mean, because impartiality is basically a synonym for equality. And I'm a good liberal just like every other educated person. Well, maybe not every other, but you know what I mean? I believe in equality. I'm an egalitarian. I believe in equal rights, equal opportunities. I believe that everybody counts, that everybody's worthwhile. So who in their right mind would criticize impartiality? But I do think that, there's an argument to be made against it. You remember in the last lecture, or the last part of this lecture, I told you that Peter Singer said that you should sell all you have and give it to the poor. That is, Peter Singer says that there's something morally wrong with our luxury spending in a world where children are starving, because whatever enjoyment we get out of our luxury spending is outweighed by the suffering we could prevent with those resources. I once read a philosopher, I wish I could remember his name. If you see the video, forgive me, I can't remember your name, but it's not my idea. But he said, if Peter Singer's right, then it's morally wrong for me to take my child to Disney World. Because to take my child to Disney World costs a lot of money, thousands of dollars. And whatever enjoyment me and my child might get out of our trip to Disney World is outweighed by the suffering we could have prevented with that money. That is, we could have just gone to the park or the beach and use the rest of that money to save starving children. But you might think, no, I agree we have an obligation to the poor. But it is not morally wrong to take your child to Disney World. Because it's your money and you earned it, but also that's your child. And you are well within your rights to put your own child's interest ahead of the other children. Maybe even the easier way. Imagine there's, God forbid, imagine that there's been some horrible tragedy at your child's school. And so you rush to pick your kid up. Are you worried about all the kids, or are you just worried about yours? And any parent will tell you, I am worried about all the kids, but I'm worried about mine first. Well, are those parents guilty of doing something morally wrong by prioritizing the interests of their own children against the interests of the other children? It's like, no, clearly not. Clearly not. Or, this is actually a debate in contemporary American politics. Should the President of the United States think about the health of the global economy and what's best for the citizens of the world? Or should he put America first and prioritize the interest of American citizens? And you might think, well, no, the President has a special obligation to the citizens of America. I mean, also, we should do what good we can in the world, but we have to put America first. You might think that's a reasonable position. Or, I mean, we're here in North Carolina. Imagine that Toyota or Tesla or somebody wants to build a factory here. And it's going to create a lot of jobs. And the governor has to decide whether or not to give them the kind of tax breaks and incentives they would need to do that. But they're also looking at a site in Georgia. They're also looking at a site in Alabama. They're also looking at a site in South Carolina, and so on. Do you think that the governor of North Carolina should think about whether or not Georgia needs it more than us? Or whether or not Alabama needs it more than us? Or do you think that he should not worry about Georgia and Alabama? He should let the governors of those states worry about them and worry about what's best for the citizens of North Carolina? You see the point here? That is, you might think the President of the United States has a special obligation to the citizens of the United States. The governor of North Carolina has a special obligation to the citizens of North Carolina. And mothers and fathers have special obligations to their own children that requires them to put their interests ahead of the interests of everybody else. If that's true, that's not impartial. You're being partial to those nearest and dearest to you. And so you might argue that impartiality can't be true either, because sometimes morality requires us to prioritize our nearest and our dearest. All right. So that's a pretty good criticism of utilitarianism, I'd say. So the principle of utility says that you should do the thing that results in the most happiness for the most people. So it's consequential, it's hedonist, and impartial. But consequentialism can't be true because there are morally relevant facts in the past. Hedonism can't be true because sometimes happiness is bad. And impartiality can't be true because morality sometimes requires us to prioritize the interest of our nearest and our dearest. Well, so that's it. That's the criticism of utilitarianism. And so at this point, you should understand, if you've watched both videos, what utilitarianism is, why there are a lot of smart people who think that this theory is probably true, and why there are a lot of smart people who think that this theory is probably false. If you are especially impressed by the criticism of utilitarianism, chances are you'll be interested in the opposing view, the view of the deontologist, that thinks that morality is about rules and rights and obligations as opposed to consequences. And that will be our discussion next week.